Hello, everybody. Almost 20 years ago, there was a wonderful book out called The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less by Barry Schwartz. In fact, when I had a pre-Keen On podcast, it was called After TV, I had Barry on the show. And it was about overabundance of choice and how it's hard to make choice in our age. We have a complimentary book out this week. It's called The Age of Choice by a University of Pennsylvania historian, Sophia Rosenfeld, A History of Freedom in Modern Life. And Sophia is joining us. She is based in Philadelphia. Sophia, I'm assuming you're all too familiar with Barry Schwartz's book, The Paradox of Choice.
I certainly am. I'm familiar with it as a book, and I'm also familiar actually with the phenomenon, as I guess most of us are at this point, which is that sort of feeling like, well, choice is supposed to be good, but how come I'm so incapable of making one that I'm happy with?
Yeah, so you agree, Sophia, with Barry Schwartz's thesis that we have too much choice, that when we go to a supermarket, we are struck with too many carrots or too many boxes of cornflakes?
You know, there are many places in which choice is a wonderful thing to have. I'm hardly opposed to the notion of choice. It's central to our notions of what it means to be a free person. That said, there are places we have such an abundance of choice that sometimes it's very hard for us to simply make up our minds. He's not wrong that if you look at 500 toothpastes, sometimes you really don't want the energy to read every package. You might just really want a choice of two good ones and pick the one that best suits your needs.
Actually, you probably want a choice of one. So your book, The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life, we take it for granted, of course, that we've always had choice historically. Where do you date the beginning of this history? I mean, I'm assuming throughout our history as a species, we've always had, in a sense, choice. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, part of being human is making all kinds of decisions, and biologists debate how much is of our own volition and how much isn't. But certainly, choice itself is not a brand new phenomenon. But what interests me is both the expansion of choice to the degree that we now have, the equivalent of Amazon as our shopping mall or the supermarket with hundreds of thousands of products. But not just that, it's also the growth of the idea that choice is what freedom is about. And that might seem obvious to us. It's part of our consumer culture, it's part of democracy and human rights. But it hasn't always been the case that choice has either been as important, as frequent, or really as validated as it is today. I think, if you go back a few hundred years, if you were, say, a nobleman somewhere, one of the great virtues of your life, one of the things that made you independent, was you didn't have to make a lot of choices. Your marriage was already arranged with someone, your income was guaranteed, your social position was given, your location was given. It's a very modern idea to feel that what really being independent or free is being able to make up your mind about what you like best from a menu of possibilities in every sphere, from profession to romance to how you want to decorate your house, what entertainments you want to participate in, and politics too.
So Sophia, you're as much an intellectual historian as anything in this book. Is there a founding theorist of choice, or do many of the founding theorists of modernity, from Hobbes to Locke to Rousseau, do they sort of take choice for granted or stumble on it?
So it's a wonderful question, because generally when people write about the history of freedom, or for that matter, if they mention choice, they think most of our ways of thinking must have come from a small set of philosophers. And certainly philosophers like Locke or John Stuart Mill have been profoundly important in shaping how we think about these concepts. But I don't think their ideas would have had any resonance if it weren't for the fact that people were starting to get used to making choices as part of daily life. So I'm as interested in how people learned, say, to be shoppers, or how they learned how to vote, as I am in precisely which philosophers said what when. So I guess if you really wanted to say sort of who's the great philosopher of thinking about freedom and choice together, Kant is important. John Stuart Mill is important, in particular in the middle of the 19th century, but they're responding to changes already in their world where the idea of selection as a way to feel empowered, maybe even a way to happiness, and certainly a way to freedom is becoming more of a norm.
I've always thought of Kant as a moral philosopher, actually a very difficult one. Um, is there a morality then associated with choice? Explain why Kant's so important in terms of this
Yeah.
narrative of choice emerging as the core feature of the human condition.
Yes, a vital question. So traditionally, when philosophers, painters, writers wanted to talk about choice, they often used a story called Hercules' Choice, based on the kind of ancient idea that Hercules stood at a crossroads and he had to make a decision. Did he do the right and virtuous thing? And that
Mm.
was sort of going towards one path, or did he make the wrong immoral choice and go the other direction? And of course, Hercules, he's a little torn, but ultimately he picks the right choice. And freedom was sometimes thought about as simply being given those two options and making the right choice, the one that was in concert with ethical responsibility, with Christian teaching. Kant said very interestingly, humans got freedom through choice, but they also got the burden of having to make up their mind about whether to do the right thing or the wrong. What changes is not just that we have more choices. It's not even just that we value choice more. It's that choice ceases to always be a moral choice. So when you go to the store and you pick one of those toothpastes, or if you're picking cotton in the 18th century in a shop, you're often just deciding, what do I like more? What's my preference? Which candidate for office do I like? Do I like the blue fabric or the brown fabric? Do I prefer to read novels, or do I prefer to read travelogues? I mean, every one of those decisions is in a sense not morally weighted anymore. And what really interests me is that what becomes morally weighted is just simply having the choice. It's not which is the good one, it's having the choice at all. And I think that doesn't really fully happen till the 20th century.
Sophia, a couple of weeks ago, we did a show with the University of Chicago professor of philosophy, Agnes Callard, who's
Oh,
just
yeah.
has a new book out on Socrates.
Mhm.
She focuses in her book, Open Socrates, on Socrates encouraging us to think for ourselves, Socrates' importance as a questioner. Did the idea of choice exist in antiquity? Are we, in a sense,
Mm.
Kant and Mill and everyone else, inheriting this from antiquity? Or did we moderns invent the very idea of choice?
I don't think in any way did we moderns invent the idea that humans make decisions all the time. Certainly, free will is an ancient subject for discussion. But this very particular way we think about choice, which is often selecting what accords with our preferences off some kind of menu of options, is, I think, a fairly modern phenomenon. It's not that it can't be found ever, but we're so used to something like a restaurant menu, a ballot, a catalog as a kind of way we interface with the world. That's really a fairly new phenomenon. Even restaurants didn't have menus till around 1800. Um, and the act of thinking with in this interior sense, what do I want? What do I desire of the things that are spelled out on this list of sorts? Whether that's, Tinder and dating, or whether that's a sandwich in a sandwich shop, that evolves over a long period of time, but really in the modern era. And that's what interests me especially. And when I think Barry Schwartz is talking about the paradox of choice, he's really responding very directly to the conditions of modern life. I'm asking sort of how did we get there?
What about the role Sophia, of religion in this. Religion, of course, is in many senses teleological. You've mentioned dating. Sometimes the narrative of dating on the shows or in romantic literature is that finally we find the person that supposedly is meant for us forever. Does your modern theory of choice inherit in a peculiar way the teleology of Christianity, in that sense, that we're always meant for one particular choice that will give meaning? And maybe I'm overdoing or over determining the connection with Christianity and that particular narrative.
It's an interesting possibility that we still think there should be a right choice, a good choice.
A final choice, a choice
final choice.
meant for us.
Marriage, for instance, is oddly a choice to give up other choices, right? You've made the choice that you want to so that you won't have infinite choice all the time because you've committed to this one person. So there are a lot of ironies in all of this. But I will say that where I see the impact of Christianity is more in the aftermath of the Reformation, which produces a kind of pluralism, a possibility that there is more than one faith or more than one, even strands within Christianity, and opens up the idea that freedom of conscience is very important to Protestantism, for instance. The idea that one has to know from the inside what's right for you. Now, we don't start picking religions the same way we start picking something in a marketplace. I don't want to make everything look exactly the same, but something about the idea of internal preferences being realized becomes possible when there are multiple options within Christianity. And you can hear this, for instance, in my own city of Philadelphia in the 18th century. You see people who come visit, they're tourists from Europe. And what do they want to do? They want to try out different churches, like entertainments, the way we might go to the movies or something. Different denominations, different preachers, they go to bookstores, there are lending libraries. All of that's new to the late 18th century and into the 19th century. And it's part of this idea of a kind of possibility of multiple options and selecting within them. But as you say, religion always has a different shape than other kinds of choices. And there is some notion that this is the kind of choice, like marriage, that will be the final one. You will make the good and the right choice, not just any choice.
The gorilla in the 100-pound or the 100-stone-ton gorilla in the room, of course, in your narrative, Sophia, is capitalism. Mm-hmm. The great historian or sociologist of religion, Max Weber, connected the Reformation with the birth of capitalism and all the uncertainty of the Reformation on the self. Is there a connection? Are you a Weberian in your analysis of the origins of capitalism and the development of the self, particularly in the context of your interest in choice and individuality?
So that is one, and you're absolutely right. That is one way you could tell the story, is that in a sense, capitalism sweeps up everything else in its wake. And we sort of reimagine the world in keeping with capitalism. And it's not totally wrong, of course. We're seeing that in politics right now, the power of capitalism in its newest form. I don't, though, collapse the two. I mean, I do think there is a sphere of religious life, for instance, that while certainly shaped to a certain degree by capitalist practices, is largely independent of it. And it's certainly in the earlier years, particularly. The places the Reformation begins, Protestantism, are not the central places where either capitalism or colonialism, for that matter, really takes off. Not in Swiss states, not in German states. I see a kind of dual origins, really, in religion and intellectual life on the one hand, and in commercial and consumer practices on the other, that by the 20th century come together in the form of choice being almost a religious value for capitalism and for democracy alike. But I don't think that the story of capitalism sweeping everything under and with it along like this in one big swoosh, it seems to me a simplification of what was actually a more complex process and a slower process.
The modern so-called science of economics, of course, comes out of this modern capitalist age. Did the fathers of economics, Smith in particular, um, did they think or rethink choice? Did they take it for granted in this new market economy where people did indeed have choice, whereas you suggested in the pre-capitalist, pre-modern age, they simply mostly didn't?
One surprising thing about Smith, I would even expected to find something about choice in Smith, and it's not really an important category for him, interestingly. Um, you might think that would be sort of central to the theorizing of capitalism from the beginning, but it's really not. He's focused much more on production. It's
Mm,
only later, really doesn't start till the marginal revolution and economic thought in the very end of the 19th century into the 20th, that consumption, what we buy, what we choose as consumers, becomes central to economic practice and economic thought. And that's an important distinction, I think. And again, it tells you something about how late a development this is. There are lots of places you might expect to see choice earlier, but it's not, for instance, in human rights declarations in the 18th century either. It's all over the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not in Smith, but it's in all the important economists of the interwar period and into the late 20th century. And what I think is so interesting is that what I call the sciences of choice, economics is one of them, psychology is another,
mm.
marketing is yet another. The 20th century is filled with the invention of fields that are designed to study what we're doing when we're making choices, why we chose what we did, what the conditions were, and sometimes even how to direct those choices in the future.
And it may not be a coincidence, of course, that the marketing of choice, the science of marketing, which is so dominant, it's like
Mhm.
us as fishes thinking about water. It's so ubiquitous, we take it for granted. Was invented by Freud's, I think it was not his grandson, his nephew. So there's certainly a connection between psychology or psychoanalysis and marketing and choice. Um,
Advertising as well. All of this comes
yeah, I
together
mean,
immediately.
advertising is that because advertising is premised on the idea of choice that we should choose one car over another, or one
Right.
dress over another, or one
Mhm.
house over another. Sophia, what about the history of America in all this? America, of
Yeah.
course, remains the dominant capitalist power, but America's history is, of course, shadowed by the great crime of slavery. How did
Mhm.
Americans make sense of this narrative of choice in the history of its country as a foundational so-called democracy, um, whilst slavery exists? And of course, the very definition of slavery is slave owners had choice. I guess they could choose
Mhm.
which slaves they owned and which they didn't. But the very definition of slavery does away with choice. Slaves don't have choice.
Absolutely true. And that's what makes the American part of this story so fascinating and sometimes heartbreaking. When we to segue from the advertising part, you're absolutely right that slaves for sale, 18th, 19th century, almost all slave ports used really market mechanisms. They had auctions. Slaves were described as choice cargo often,
Mm.
and buyers were given choice among the choice cargo the same way they might with bolts of cloth. I mean, it's that depersonalizing. And certainly all the choice, all the notion of variety, all the volition lies on the side of those who'd be the purchasers or the sellers. Um, and earlier definitions of freedom often imagine slavery, dependency, as the antithesis of being a freestanding person who has some kind of autonomy, is being not dependent. But it's not necessarily about choice in the same way. As choice becomes an important variable in thinking about freedom, actually, it starts to fuel, among other things, abolitionism. In part, the idea that the one thing that enslaved people don't have is any kind of choice about their sexual partners and about their laboring bodies. And bodily autonomy, not having choice about one's body, either in terms of work or sexual activities of any kind, it becomes a kind of major claim of abolitionists in the 19th century, and helps in some ways eat away at the possibility of imagining humans who are unfree, enslaved peoples. But it's a complicated story, and like everything else, choice has both abetted and hampered freedom efforts for Black people and for all kinds of people at different moments.
And I wonder, Sophia, whether intellectual form is important here. It occurs to me that the invention of the novel and its domination, not domination, but certainly influenced by female writers and, of course, female readers, shaped the idea, if not of feminism, certainly of feminine choice. I'm thinking of some of the classic 18th and 19th century British novels by women. How does this play?
Mm-hmm. So novels were one of my great sources for writing this, because novels are fundamentally, they are a product of the 18th and 19th century, the modern realist novel. And the plots of novels, if you stop and think about it, are often about choices, especially women's choices. From Anna Karenina to Madame Bovary to, you could give a Portrait of a Lady. It's often a woman who's feeling enormous social pressures, familial pressures, economic pressures to do one thing, but at some level has this kind of interior desire to do something else. Often that's a romantic interest that runs counter to expectations. But there are even scenes of things like shopping. There's women are often the authors, they're often the subjects, and they're often the readers of these stories that are about women both grappling with specific choices, but even more grappling with the problem of choice itself. How much do I get to say what happens to me? What are my options? And if you look at novels, you mentioned 19th century English novels, they're filled with scenes of choices, critical moments in the plot, ball scenes, who will choose whom to dance with, election scenes, who picks whom. That kind of social dynamic, the constraints, the possibilities, is fundamental to the novel. So I think of the novel as both an invention of the era of choice and the great tool for dramatizing choice. And that's true even for modern novels.
Sophia, how did you negotiate the issue of Marx and capitalism and culture? Of course, the traditional notion is that capitalism shaped everything else. Capitalism is obviously very important in this. I mean, it's in many ways what choice is. But in terms of cause and effect of these types of novels, of Jane Austen, of readers and women and the market, where do you begin and end, or is that too simplistic a question?
No, it's a good question, because in a very strict Marxist schema, everything is in a sense a reflection of who owns property and how it's manipulated, shared, distributed. And Marx wasn't wrong at all about the impact of our economic structures and our economic relations on everything else. That said, and maybe this is my bias as a kind of cultural and intellectual historian, I see a more two-way street. That the very act, for instance, of writing and reading novels surely had an impact and also how people imagined themselves. So, and those people then went into markets with new conceptions of themselves. So rather than see everything either come straight down like philosophers and we just follow what they do, or on the other hand, we're just economic actors all the time, I think there's much more give and take between the social practices we engage in, the way we talk about them, and the ideas we form of them. And it's a kind of reciprocal process. So for instance, if you find it very easy to go in and to a restaurant and order something off a menu, as most modern Western people do at this point, you think that seems like a natural thing for humans to do, but in fact, it's a kind of socially conditioned practice. The fact we attach that to some kind of freedom is also a socially and culturally conditioned practice. It doesn't have to stand for that, but that's something we've made it stand for. And I don't see that as simply an effect of the existence of business and private enterprise. I see that as a kind of web of meanings, activities we do, and thoughts and ways of describing them that are kind of deeply enmeshed in our activities. And what I like to do is find things generally that we do without thinking about them much and try to kind of pull apart or uncode why we do these things. Where did they come from? How do they affect us? Things you might not ask because some of these things are so ordinary.
What about the history of democracy in your age of choice, Sophia? Some critics of contemporary democracy think that democracy is simply being presented as to voters as a choice between one kind of soap powder or one kind of chocolate or another. Are you critical of that conception of political freedom in modern life? Where do you date this from? I assume middle of the 19th century with mass voting.
Right. So in the 19th century, something really extraordinary happens that we don't talk about very much. We definitely talk about the expansion of who gets to vote. Gradually, people without property, gradually, people of color, gradually, women. Very, very slow process. But we don't talk much about the change in how we vote. I think people tend to assume that in the 18th century, people voted sort of the way they do now, but that's not really true. The idea of the secret ballot, of privatized voting, only becomes universal in the last quarter of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and then it becomes a kind of global world standard for what a safe and good election is. But that's not the case to begin with. And voting was a much more communal activity. Only with the rise of notions of choice, voting is a kind of late piece in the story, came the idea that, we should be in a kind of secluded space where we could look at our own mind to figure out what our choice was when it came to political leaders. Not
It's almost it inherits the confession as this
Yes.
place where we're self-realized, but in a very different kind of sense.
So John Stuart Mill, who you would think would have been much in favor of this because he was a kind of great philosopher of choice, was really horrified by the idea of voting privately like this. And, for many people, it seemed like confession, or it seemed like some kind of shopping. It seemed like something where your whim and your fancy and the wrong impulses were shaping your choices. And he really worried that privatized voting was going to result in what you're talking about today, this idea that, we get a list of two or three things, maybe five things, and none of them really correspond with anything we like. But our only activity as a democratic citizen is to kind of pick one and get out of there, as opposed to a collective, deliberative decision-making process. But the world has gone in the direction and away from collaborative voting and the social pressures involved towards individualized private voting. And there have been gains and losses, as with everything. There are gains in sort of the autonomy one has as a voter, but the loss is the idea that, as you say, you don't get to pick the options. They rarely reflect in any direct way the people's desires. They're just the options that parties have handed us in many ways. And we think our entire democratic engagement, aside from maybe commenting on social media, is the one day a year we go pick between these different options and walk out of there.
Yeah, and of course, there are lots of modern theorists. Arendt comes to mind, who look back at antiquity, particularly Aristotle, with the idea of the public sphere. And your argument about this age of choice has resulted in the interiorization of politics.
So yes. And since you started with Barry Schwartz, he's interested in what happens, the sort of psychological pressures on the individual, in particular, in our kind of obsession with choice. But another way, and this is something some political theorists bring up too, another way of thinking about the problem of choice is that it also often distracts us from public-minded things or the common good, since you're talking about Arendt here. It takes us away from thinking not what do I want, but how would we work together to collectively achieve something we might all need, but to get there might have to limit my choices. So let's say we all benefit from clean air or good drinking water. What I choose in each of those is, in a sense, not the critical question. It's how do we collectively get to a place where we'd have cleaner air? And sometimes that might mean limiting, say, consumer choices. So there are lots of places in which choice can free us, for sure, but choice can also trap us in ways where we can't act very effectively towards the common good. We lose sight of the public, and we still feel even burdened in this very particular way where all the responsibility lies on us for our own happiness and our own success.
Yeah, you mentioned Mill, of course, who had a very ambivalent relationship with utilitarianism. He was the godson of Bentham, father of James Mill, one of the founders of utilitarianism. The idea that we're all calculating machines and that we can add up our pleasures and pain, and we always want more pleasure rather than pain. I'm assuming that the modern thinking about utilitarianism, which now has acquired digital form in the computer age, is very much bound up in the notion of choice, is that we can calculate these things. And when we miscalculate, we're somehow going against the laws of nature. I think of somebody like Thomas Frank, who argues about American voters. He's a left populist arguing that the American working class has historically always voted against its own interests.
Yeah, I mean, the chief spokesman for this position these days are really behavioral economists, though
Yeah.
it's trickled into lots of other fields too. But they argue that the sort of the rational choice vision of the individual as when they have the right information, knowing their own mind to be able to consistently pick what they like, is actually not really what humans are much like. And that when you test this empirically, you find that people pick things that go contrary to their own interests all the time. In politics, for sure, but just as much you come home with a purchase and you think, why did I buy that? If I really meant to save my money, or I already have one of those, or what, or you have buyer's regret and you say, oh, I'm not sure I picked the best one. That we really aren't very good at picking in most spheres, and we're constantly being misled by things like advertising because we're very susceptible to persuasion, and that the rational choice, sort of perfect economic actor, is really such a fiction that to use it as a model, whether for policy or anything else, is distorting in a way. And that does take you back, as you say, to philosophers who were interested in the way that the passions, the heat of the moment, for instance, were always understood to be countervailing forces, that we weren't really rational beings, at least 50% of the time.
Yeah, I mean, we're hard to make sense of. I mean, progressives these days are angry that so many people within the working class voted for Trump, and many of them will say, well, they voted against their own interest, and Trump's going to, maybe not literally, but metaphorically screw them. What do those kind of arguments tell us about why, Sophia, we make choices? Like, for example, voting for Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, it's everybody is fascinated by this question. There are people for whom he reflects obviously exactly what they would like to see happen in the world. But then there are lots of people where you think, why? What was the appeal? And the old notion that most people, back to your question about Marx, that people will in the end of the day vote their pocketbooks, for instance, has not really been borne out. People are often much more interested in symbolic issues. They root for a team, for instance, in a way that might run counter to their interests. So there are people, I mean, people can imagine, actually, people on the left and people on the right vote against their interests. When wealthy, college educated people vote for higher taxes, they're voting against their immediate interests, in the sense they're voting for they imagine some greater good. When a a Republican voter who relies on Obamacare votes for smaller government and a cap on all kinds of spending on medicine. They've chosen something else to vote about, not their own pocketbooks and their own well-being. It turns out people's motivations, they're self-interest, but not self-interest that can always be measured in economist terms. Sometimes they'd rather see somebody else be punished than win themselves, that kind of thing. We're complicated people.
We are, and Bentham, of
No.
course, tried to simplify us. Let's fast forward to the modern age. We've already mentioned Trump, enough of him. What about the trans issue? It seems to me, Sophia, a very controversial issue, both on the left and the right. It seems in a sense that this is the almost absurd logical conclusion of our age of choice, that we can not only choose what peanut butter we buy, what toothpaste we use, but what gender we have. How does the trans issue or the politics and the technology of that fit into your narrative on the age of choice?
So this is a really interesting question. So complicated about sexuality and gender identity, both. In many ways, we've moved on the question of gender increasingly towards this idea that, again, how one presents to the world, how one self-identifies is a matter of individual choice. And that is a bridge too far for many people, I'm well aware. On the other hand, there's also a kind of, this is who I am, natural. This is sort of intrinsic to me discourse here that suggests this isn't a matter of trying on appearances or something, but is intrinsic to the self. And there you have more of an echo of what happened. And it's important to think about areas we've also said are sort of apart from choice. Gay rights movement, very interestingly, certainly the move towards marriage rights for gay people was premised on the idea that gay people should have the same basic choices as heterosexual people, no doubt about it. But why was because people were naturally straight or gay. There's no doubt that the discourse, not that gender was not a preference, it was an orientation that was much more natural than people were biologically something or the other. You might call this a kind of bioessentialism. And you find some of the same tension in discussions of trans rights, whether one is for or against, which is to say there are elements of essentialism, this is who I am, and there are elements of it's my choice, how I want to live, and I should have the same choices as everyone else about what that's going to look like. And I find that extremely interesting. We grapple all the time with not is choice a good thing, but what should be the few things that we leave out of the world of choice. And there are quite a few things that we have decided collectively or that we're fighting over, whether they really belong in the realm of choice or not.
I'm not sure if you saw the last year's movie, Will and Harper. It's a film about Will Ferrell and Harper Lee, the Saturday Night Live people. And Harper Steele changed his or her gender. And the way that it's a nonfiction film, but the way it was presented as if he or she, I guess, always knew that she was a she. And so it was a return rather than a choice.
Right. So that's where it's complicated because choice is there and biology are kind of intersecting in ways that are complicated. And if you really look at this discourse, you'll see elements of both running through it, that there's something that one knows what one really is at the core is to not say it's a choice. But there's also the idea that given who one is, one should have the autonomy to be able to make a choice about how to express that to the rest of the world and how to live. And it's a compelling argument, but it's a complicated one. And I think we'll see a lot more wrestling with this in years to come. I think even generations see this question differently. I see the trans question, though, as very much, though, a question about the space of choice at its most fundamental, even at the thing you might think was the one space where we, in a sense, had the least choice.
And I wonder whether in the future, with new technologies of one kind or another, we'll even have the same issues of choice when it comes to race?
Race is one of those categories that to date has been not only exempt from choice, but often thought to be sort of pernicious when choice enters the conversation. You cannot pick your race, though you could pick your religion, for instance. You're not thought to be able to pick your race. Is there a reason that race is different from gender here? Probably it has more to do with politics than it does with something that could be described as biological. But every society will have to think, where is choice something that's socially permissible, and where is this something we want to take out of the terrain of individual choice?
Sophia, you mentioned sexuality. How has this been treated in terms of choice? The original Kinsey report, I remember, not that I'm an expert on this stuff, but it revolutionized how Americans thought about sexuality by suggesting that whatever it was, 10 or 15% of Americans were quote unquote naturally gay. How does this play into your age of choice? There's been some interesting debates recently, given that more and more women are coming out as gay. And there are, I think, some people, Andrew Sullivan comes to mind, who suggest that that there's nothing natural about it. It seems to be culturally driven.
I can't, I can pontificate about a lot of things, but probably not about the biology of sexual attraction. I think the point, though, is that in the age of choice, we have largely said that consenting adults can choose who they want to love and who they want to have sex with and how they want to have sex with them in ways that were not possible until quite recently. I mean, it's amazing how recent this shift has been and how thorough it has been. Certainly, there's been a push towards imagining choice, especially for women, as if once the choice was, could women vote or could they be educated and how? Now, choice questions have gone to questions about reproductive health, to questions about wanting to be a parent at all, questions about sexual identity, questions about sexual behavior. This has been sort of fundamental to modern feminism, as it has been to the gay rights movement. Where that goes from here is unclear. I think much of the pushback in much of the world against women's choices is a way at pushing back against an entire paradigm, which is this notion of freedom as choice at its core. So
Yeah, and I wonder
so
on the Sophia, on the abortion issue, which of course you spend a lot of time in the book discussing. It's an important issue. Is the intellectual terrain of choice, is it the same one that both the pro-life and the abortion rights activists, are they fighting on the same terrain? In other words, for for one group, it's about the rights, the right to choice of the unborn. For others, it's the right of women. Or are they dealing with choice in a fundamentally different kind of way?
So that's a great question. So I think in the 1970s, right after the decision of Roe v. Wade in the US, and right as abortion debates were happening in the UK, and there was a little bit earlier in France, the same moment, for instance, the language of choice seemed like a good solution to many people because it was something nobody was opposed to. So you didn't have to like abortion. You just had to sort of say, well, shouldn't people have choice? And the idea was
it's the old bumper sticker in Berkeley, which I used to enjoy, which said, "Don't like an abortion," and then don't have one.
Exactly. So the premise was going to be, who's going to be opposed to this? Just let people pick this option. And if you don't like the option, you don't have to have one. Exactly. Of course, it backfired. Partly it backfired because of a very clever opposition strategy, which is not, it's a bad choice or something, but it was the right to life. And life sounded like a much more, in some ways, full and ethical option. It was sort of an ethical space as opposed to this kind of potentially consumerist space of pick what you want. So initially, I would say to you that the pro-life or the anti-abortion forces were really fighting on very different ground. They countered the notion of choice. But over time, they have as well evolved towards choice. Two manifestations of that. One is the the adoption of the phrase itself by the right, you've now often being used against vaccines and against other kind of my body, my choice has become a kind of right-wing mantra as much as it is a left-wing mantra. And the other one is adopting the notion of religious choice to fight against abortion, to say, well, you can't tell me if my religion has me choosing, that abortion is a bad thing, you can't ask me to spend my money, my tax dollars on it, that sort of thing. So there was a kind of counter, even within the pro-life movement, using the same language of choice against this particular choice. And right now we've seen that the language of choice does not have a right or left flavor. It's been adopted for different purposes. Abortion rights are called right to choose on the left, and school choice, for instance, is a mantra for the right. So, or choice when it comes to public health questions. So you really get this value kind of across the board at this point.
Sophia, where are we finally? You've been very generous with your time in 2025 in terms of the age of choice. Is this the beginning, the twilight of the age of choice? It occurs to me, I read a piece recently about children who are choosing to divorce their parents, who are choosing, I guess, not to acknowledge their parents. We've already talked about the trans issue. Are we at the end of this period where everything becomes choice, or are we still perhaps in the early stages of your history?
And this is where I get to say historians are lucky they get to talk about what's already happened rather than guess what's going to happen. But I will try, because this week has been interesting. I'll take the US as an example here. Of course, there's been an enormous amount of discussion of some of the sort of more authoritarian language and also policy proposals that have emerged immediately after the inauguration of President Trump. But if you look closely, it was in the inauguration speech, and it was in one of the most important executive orders of the week. There was a lot of discussion of you'll be able to get the car of your choice. You'll have freedom of choice when it comes to appliances and light bulbs, is in one of the energy doctrines. And you think, what is this about? Of course, it's about empowering businesses to a certain degree and avoiding regulation. But it taps into that old idea that you personally are going to be free. The state is going to change its form, but you personally can still go to a store and choose the light bulb you want, not the one that the state tells you to buy. And I think that's really interesting because it takes this kind of ethos and grafts it onto something new, a more authoritarian politics, for sure. So I do not think we have entered the age of the end of choice. In fact, I think we're still squarely in it. And many of our fights in the next few years are going to be about exactly what the sphere of choice is going to look like. The trans question, the energy consumption question, all of these things sound quite different, but I'm quite convinced that choice is not going away anytime soon.
Certainly the word isn't. I mean, with environmentalists, a lot of people argue you have no choice, but of course there are others who believe we do. Finally, Sophia, what about the fate of choice like vinyl, and in the sense that we're nostalgic for a previous age? I rather like going to restaurants where I don't have to look at a menu and choose.
Yes.
I rather like the idea indeed of maybe an AI or a supermarket where I'm given what it thinks I want. Do you think there's something in us, perhaps, and oddly enough, this will be borne out in economics and in marketing, that we will embrace options that do away with choice?
I think we'll have to, in some ways, because too much choice is overwhelming. If your menu has 50 pages, how do you know what you want to eat for
Well, then
dinner?
you just tell your wife to order for you.
I do the same with my husband. Exactly. I say, pick something for me. Exactly. And that's the most common point is that we look to someone else. We look to AI, we look to a spouse, we look to wealthy people pay people to decorate their houses and help them get dressed and manage their money and, in a sense, make all the choices for them, right? That's what you hire people to do, with the idea they know better how to decorate your house or how to invest your money. Advisors of all sorts. So AI will probably play that function for most of us. In some ways, that's a reassuring thing, and in some ways, it's a little scary.
Well, Sophia Rosenfeld, I tried not to make too many dumb jokes on choice, but I have to make one. I'm glad I make the choice of having you on the show. It's a fascinating subject. We take choice for granted, but the history of freedom in modern life is, as you know, very much bound up with choice. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the show. Congratulations on the book, and I hope you will choose and I will choose to come back on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Step on the scene, I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keane, yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew King, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.